At 11:43 on the morning of September 11, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel Malcolm C. Lewis, 34 years old, 0 combat missions flown, 0 confirmed innovations deployed in actual combat, stood on the tarmac at Kimbolton Airfield watching 47 Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses lift off into English fog, pound general-purpose bombs, their crews carrying something every aeronautical engineer in the Army Air Forces had called physically impossible. 230 miles ahead, German 88mm flak batteries waited at Ruland. The most lethal ED in the past 14 days, the 8th Air Force had lost 63 heavy bombers over that single target complex. General Curtis LeMay had called Lewis's wire mesh system a waste of critical materials. Colonel Bud Peasley called it aeronautical fantasy. The Wright Field engineers calculated that Lewis's design violated 3 fundamental laws of formation aerodynamics and would cause mid-air collisions within minutes of entering hostile airspace. They were all wrong. The 8th Air Force had been hemorrhaging bombers since August. The bombing campaign against German oil production had entered its most desperate phase. Ruland, Merseburg, Leuna, synthetic fuel plants protected by flak concentrations that turned the sky into solid walls of shrapnel. Between August 24th and September 10th, the 8th had lost 347 heavy bombers, not to fighters, to flak. The B-17G Flying Fortress weighed 36,135 pounds empty, 65,500 pounds maximum loaded. 4 Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines producing 1,200 horsepower each, cruising speed 182 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. The aircraft could theoretically absorb tremendous punishment. Self-sealing fuel tanks, armored crew positions, redundant control systems, but the German 88mm flak 36 fired a 20.3-pound high-explosive shell to 26,000 feet, impact radius 200 feet. The shells detonated into 1,500 shrapnel fragments traveling at 4,200 feet per second. A single fragment could sever control cables. 3 fragments could ignite a fuel cell. 5 could kill everyone in the radio compartment. Standard defensive formation doctrine called for 5-4 aircraft, 3 squadron elements stacked in altitude, aircraft separated by 150 feet lateral, 100 feet vertical. The formation provided overlapping fields of fire against fighters, but against flak, it was slaughter geometry. Concentrated formations meant concentrated targets. German flak commanders didn't aim at individual bombers. They aimed at grid coordinates and turned cubic airspace into kill boxes. In 7 days of operations over Ruland and Merseburg, the 384th Bombardment Group had lost 19 aircraft, the 94th had lost 16, the 447th had lost 14. Casualty rates exceeded 20% per mission, statistically unsustainable. The crews called missions to the synthetic oil plants coffin runs. Replacements arrived at bases and flew their first mission to Merseburg. Half didn't return. New pilots arrived. They died. The cycle repeated. On September 9th, General James Doolittle, commander of the 8th Air Force, convened an emergency tactics conference at High Wycombe. Representatives from every bombardment group, subject how to reduce flak losses without abandoning strategic targets. 37 proposals were presented. Increased altitude operations, but oxygen systems couldn't support effective bombing above 28,000 feet. Night missions, but accuracy dropped below 15%. Reduced formation density, but then fighters massacred the dispersed bombers. Electronic jamming, developmental, not ready. Lewis presented proposal number 38. He called it Geometric Dispersion Protocol. The engineers called it the Steel Net. The pilots, once they understood what Lewis was suggesting, called it suicide. Malcolm Clarence Lewis grew up in Massillon, Ohio, working in his father's structural engineering firm. Not romantic. He spent his teenage years calculating load-bearing tolerances for bridge trusses and factory frameworks. He graduated from Case Institute of Technology in 1932 with a degree in mechanical engineering. Mathematics, not flying, was his expertise. He learned to fly in 1938 at Cleveland Municipal Airport, a civilian pilot's license, nothing military. He flew a Piper J3 Cub on weekends, treating aviation as applied physics. He'd take a stopwatch and notebook aloft, timing turns, measuring climb rates, calculating drag coefficients. Other pilots flew for the sensation. Lewis flew to test equations. When war broke out, he tried to enlist as a pilot. The Army rejected him, 31 years old, marginal eyesight, no military flight training. He ended up with a reserve commission doing logistics analysis at Patterson Field, Dayton. Paperwork, supply chain optimization, moving numbers on requisition forms. In early 1943, he requested transfer to operational planning. The 8th Air Force was expanding rapidly in England, and they needed staff officers who understood engineering. Lewis arrived at High Wycombe in June 1943 as a major assigned to the tactical analysis section. His job involved reading mission reports and calculating loss rates, not flying, not commanding, just mathematics. He'd receive after-action reports from each bombardment group, aircraft lost, probable cause, target results, and compiled statistical summaries for headquarters. He noticed a pattern by November. Fighter losses were declining. The introduction of P-51 Mustang escorts had changed the air war. German interceptors couldn't reach the bomber streams without running a gauntlet of American fighters. But flak losses were increasing, steadily, methodically. The Germans were shifting their defensive emphasis from fighters to anti-aircraft artillery. By March 1944, flak accounted for 67% of bomber losses over Germany. By June, it was 73%. The 8th Air Force was winning the fighter war and losing the flak war. Lewis spent 4 months studying formation geometry. Not as a pilot. He barely qualified to fly a desk, but as an engineer. He obtained reconnaissance photographs of German flak batteries. He studied burst patterns. He calculated shrapnel dispersion geometry. He interviewed returning crews, asking specific questions. How close were adjacent aircraft? How much vertical separation? When shells burst, how many aircraft took simultaneous damage? He discovered something that contradicted every assumption in formation doctrine. Tight formations weren't safer. They were death traps. The current doctrine concentrated aircraft to maximize defensive firepower against fighters, but it also concentrated them as targets for flak. A single flak shell bursting in the center of a tight formation could damage 3, 4, 5 aircraft simultaneously. The shrapnel didn't discriminate. It shredded everything within 200 feet. Lewis calculated what if formations spread out, but in a specific geometric pattern that maintained defensive capability while minimizing flak effectiveness. Not random dispersion, controlled dispersion, mathematical dispersion. He called it the steel net, a 3-dimensional geometric lattice where each bomber occupied a precise coordinate in space, separated by distances calculated to prevent single shells from damaging multiple aircraft, but close enough that gunners could still provide overlapping defensive fire. The problem was altitude coordination. Keeping dozens of aircraft in precise 3-dimensional positions at 25,000 feet, in weather, in combat, while evading flak and maintaining bomb run headings. Impossible, according to every pilot who reviewed the concept. Lewis presented his proposal to the operations staff in April 1944. Colonel Bud Peasley, a veteran group commander with 29 combat missions, called it aeronautical fantasy dreamed up by a man who's never been shot at. General Frederick Castle told Lewis that formation flying was already the most demanding task in combat aviation. Adding complex geometric calculations would cause mid-air collisions before the formation reached Germany. The Wright Field aeronautical engineers submitted a formal analysis stating that Lewis's proposed dispersion pattern would increase fuel consumption by 18% and reduce maximum range below mission requirements. Every bombardment group commander believed tight formations were the only survivable approach. That was doctrine. That was training. That was experience. In June, the 92nd Bombardment Group lost 8 aircraft in a single flak burst over Magdeburg. 1 shell. 8 B-17s damaged simultaneously. 3 went down immediately. 5 limped back to England and crash-landed. Lewis showed the after-action report to his commanding officer and requested permission to conduct a test mission using his dispersion geometry. Permission denied. Too risky, unproven, potentially catastrophic. On July 7th, the 8th Air Force lost 37 bombers over Merseburg, flak. On July 20th, they lost 41 over Leipzig, flak. On August 24th, they lost 38 over Merseburg. Same target, same flak batteries, same slaughter. They were all wrong about what made formations survive. What Lewis had discovered wasn't about spread. It was about positioning in a way that contradicted everything Air Corps Tactical School taught about mutual support and concentration of fire. If you want to see how Lewis proved that mathematics could save lives when courage couldn't, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories like this. And please subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Malcolm Lewis and his impossible geometry. Lewis spent August working the mathematics. The German 88mm Flak 36 had specific characteristics. Muzzle velocity 2,690 feet per second, time to 25,000 feet altitude, 22 seconds. Burst radius effective against aircraft 200 feet. Rate of fire 15 to 20 rounds per minute per gun. Typical flak battery, 6 guns. Roland was defended by 84 heavy flak guns arranged in 14 batteries forming a box pattern around the synthetic oil plant. When a bomber formation approached, German fire control radar would calculate the formation's altitude, heading, and speed. The batteries would fire into a predetermined grid coordinate, creating a flak box, a cube of airspace measuring roughly 1,000 feet on each side, filled with exploding shells. Standard doctrine said fly through it fast and pray. But Lewis noticed something in the after-action reports. When formations flew tight, aircraft separated by 100 to 150 feet, single shells damaged multiple bombers. But when formations became disrupted, aircraft scattered by evasive action or damaged bombers falling out of position, loss rates didn't increase. Sometimes they decreased. The math was brutal. Current formation geometry placed 18 aircraft within a 400-foot cube of airspace. One flak shell bursting in the center of that cube could theoretically damage all 18. Probability calculations suggested an average of 4.2 aircraft damaged per shell burst in that geometry. Lewis needed to increase separation without losing defensive capability. He spent 2 weeks calculating optimal spacing. Too far apart and German fighters would exploit the gaps. Too close, and flak would kill them in clusters. The balance point existed somewhere in three-dimensional space, and Lewis needed to find it using nothing but trigonometry and combat data. He determined that aircraft needed to be separated by 280 feet laterally, 180 feet in trail, and 150 feet vertically. Those specific distances would prevent a single shell from damaging more than one aircraft, while keeping formations tight enough for mutual defensive fire. But implementing that geometry required something that didn't exist. A formation system where every pilot knew his exact position relative to every other aircraft in 3 dimensions, constantly, without visual reference to all aircraft. Standard formation flying relied on visual station keeping. Each pilot maintained position by watching the lead aircraft and nearby wingmen. But Lewis's geometry required precision beyond visual capability, especially in clouds or at night. Lewis realized he needed a formation device, not a technological solution. He didn't have time to develop new equipment. He needed a procedural solution using existing aircraft instruments. The answer was already in every cockpit: altimeters, airspeed indicators, and compass headings. If he could create a system where each aircraft maintained precise altitude, heading, and speed relative to the leader, they'd automatically maintain proper geometric spacing. The formation would become a mathematical lattice, a steel net stretched across the sky, with each bomber occupying a calculated coordinate. He designed a formation card, a laminated chart listing every aircraft's assigned position, altitude to the foot, heading to the degree, indicated airspeed to the mile per hour, and position offset from the lead aircraft. Pilots wouldn't fly visual formation, they'd fly instrument formation. Each pilot would scan his instruments, not his wingman, maintaining exact parameters. In theory, it would work. In practice, it required formation discipline beyond anything demanded before. Lewis realized the system would only work if pilots trusted their instruments more than their eyes. That contradicted every instinct in formation flying. Pilots were trained to keep visual contact. Losing sight of your wingman meant you were lost, vulnerable, separated from the protection of the formation. Lewis's system required pilots to accept periods of zero visual contact, flying in clouds, in smoke, in weather, while maintaining formation position purely by instrument reference. The innovation wasn't the geometry, it was the mindset shift. He tested the concept in late August, using a single squadron from the 384th Bombardment Group, 12 B-17s. He briefed the pilots personally: "You're going to fly a formation where you won't see anyone except maybe the aircraft directly in front of you. You're going to maintain position using altitude, heading, and airspeed. Nothing." The pilots looked at him like he'd suggested flying inverted. First practice mission, they achieved approximately 60% proper positioning. 3 near collisions. Pilots kept breaking instrument discipline to search visually for nearby aircraft, which threw off their own positioning and disrupted the entire formation geometry. Second practice mission, 70% proper positioning. Number collisions. The pilots started understanding that if everyone maintained their exact parameters, the formation geometry held automatically. Third practice mission, 85% compliance. The lead navigator reported something unexpected. Fuel consumption was actually lower than conventional formations. The reduced turbulence from wider spacing decreased drag. Fourth practice mission, September 5th. Lewis arranged for RAF reconnaissance to photograph the formation from above. The pictures showed what looked like a three-dimensional grid. 47 bombers spread across 2 cubic miles of sky, but each precisely positioned at their assigned coordinate, a steel net. He showed the photographs to General Doolittle on September 7th. Doolittle studied them for 3 minutes. Then he asked the question that mattered. Can they bomb accurately from this formation? That was the real test. Bombing accuracy depended on the lead bombardier's calculations. In standard formations, the other bombers in the group dropped when they saw the leader's bombs release. Visual reference, tight formation, bombs impacted in a concentrated pattern. But in Lewis's dispersed formation, visual cues would be harder to see. Lewis had an answer. He'd equipped each aircraft with a colored smoke flare mounted in the bomb bay. When the lead bombardier released his bombs, he'd simultaneously fire his flare, a bright red smoke trail falling with the bombs. Every bombardier in the formation could see that smoke trail and release on it, even from 280 feet away. Doolittle authorized one combat test mission, maximum risk, maximum potential. Target: Roland Synthetic Oil Plant, the most heavily defended target in Germany. If Lewis's formation could survive Roland, it could survive anything. September 11, 1944. 47 B-17s from the 384th Bombardment Group would fly the first operational steel net mission. The crews called it the math mission during briefing. Some complained that they were being used as guinea pigs for a desk officer's theory. Others, after hearing the casualty rates from previous Roland missions, were willing to try anything. Lewis wasn't flying on the mission. His flight status didn't qualify him for combat operations. He'd watch his system go to war from Kimbolton's control tower, tracking radio reports, waiting for the bombers to return, or not return. At 11:43, the first B-17 lifted off. By 12:15, all 47 were airborne, forming up over the English coast in Lewis's steel net geometry. Each pilot had his formation card clipped to his yoke. Exact heading, exact airspeed. They disappeared into the clouds, heading east toward Germany. The formation crossed the Dutch coast at 13:20 hours. Lieutenant Robert Hinman, flying in the number 3 position of the lead squadron, reported later that the first hour over Europe felt wrong. He couldn't see most of his group, just the lead aircraft, 280 feet ahead and 150 feet above, empty sky to his left and right. Every instinct told him the formation had scattered, but his instruments showed precise parameters. Altitude 24,000 feet, heading 092 degrees, indicated airspeed 166 miles per hour. The formation card said that put him exactly where he belonged. The German early warning radar stations picked up the formation at 13:45, approximately 60 miles inside German airspace. At 14:10, the formation began its initial point turn toward Roland. 90-degree left turn, standard combat procedure. In conventional formations, this turn would tighten the formation as aircraft on the inside of the turn reduced power and aircraft on the outside increased power to maintain position. But Lewis's system required something different. Each aircraft would execute the turn at their assigned airspeed and bank angle, letting the geometry naturally adjust. It worked. The formation completed the turn with all aircraft still in proper position, still maintaining the 280-foot lateral separation. At 14:23, the first flak bursts appeared. German flak batteries at Roland opened fire at maximum range 26,000 feet. The first shells burst 2,000 feet below the formation, ranging shot. The German fire control radar was calculating exact altitude. At 14:25, flak bursts bracketed the formation. Black smoke puffs appeared directly at 24,000 feet, scattered throughout the bomber stream. This was where conventional formations would start taking casualties. Concentrated aircraft, concentrated fire, concentrated damage. Lieutenant Arthur Gannon, flying right flank position, felt his B-17 shudder as shrapnel punched through the vertical stabilizer. 16 holes. But the aircraft on his left, 280 feet away, took no damage from that burst. The separation worked. That same shell, in a conventional formation, would have damaged 3 aircraft. At 14:27, the formation entered the main flak box. The German batteries fired in coordinated volleys. 84 guns, 12 shells per minute per gun, over 1,000 shells per minute filling a cubic mile of airspace. The sky turned black. Solid walls of explosions. In conventional formations, pilots would see the aircraft next to them getting hit. They'd see wings torn off, engines exploding, bombers falling. The psychological impact would ripple through the formation. Pilots would flinch, break formation, cluster together seeking the comfort of proximity, which only made them better targets. But in Lewis's formation, most pilots couldn't see adjacent aircraft. They flew instruments, the flak bursts surrounded them. Explosions above, below, left, right, but the steel net geometry meant those explosions, statistically, were bursting between aircraft rather than directly on them. At 14:29, the bombardier in the lead aircraft, Lieutenant Donald Crossman, began his bomb run. Straight and level, no evasive action. Exactly 12 minutes from IP to target. The Norden bomb site required stable flight for accurate calculations. Every bombardier in the formation watched Crossman's aircraft, waiting for the smoke flare. German flak intensified. The battery's new bomber doctrine, straight and level, meant predictable trajectories. They fired barrage patterns, filling the projected flight path with shells timed to burst exactly at bomber altitude. At 14:31, a flak burst detonated directly underneath Lieutenant William Morrison's aircraft. Shrapnel shredded the ball turret and punctured the No. 3 fuel tank. The B-17 dropped 300 feet, momentarily out of formation position. Morrison fought the controls, regained altitude, checked his instruments. Altitude 24,000 feet, heading 092 degrees, airspeed 166. Despite the damage, despite the drop, his position parameters told him where to fly. He maneuvered back into position in the steel net. In a conventional formation, Morrison's aircraft would have disrupted surrounding bombers. Pilots would have broken formation to avoid collision. The gap would have but in the dispersed geometry, Morrison's temporary displacement affected only his immediate position. The rest of the formation held. At 14:33, another aircraft took damage. Lieutenant Charles Webster, flying in the 2nd Squadron's low element, felt his No. 2 engine hit. Shrapnel severed oil lines. The engine began trailing thick. Standard procedure called for shutting down the damaged engine and dropping out of formation. A 3-engine B-17 couldn't maintain formation speed or altitude, but Webster checked his formation card. With one engine out, he calculated he could maintain 158 miles per hour and 23,400 feet altitude, close enough to his assigned parameters that he could stay in approximate position. He reduced power on the remaining engines, adjusted trim, and stayed in formation. The 600-foot vertical tolerance in Lewis's geometry gave him room to operate. At 14:35, the formation reached bombs away point. Crossman released his bombs and simultaneously fired the red smoke flare. Bright crimson smoke fell toward the target, visible to every bombardier in the formation. Across 2 cubic miles of sky, 47 bombardiers pressed their release switches within 3 seconds of seeing that smoke. 282,000 pounds of high-explosive bombs fell toward Ruland synthetic oil plant. Then the formation executed the rally turn. 90 degrees right, heading 182 degrees, beginning the egress route back toward England. This was the second most dangerous moment. Rally turns after bombing were predictable. German flak would already be firing at the projected turn coordinates, and turns in Lewis's formation required precise execution. Each aircraft had to turn at their assigned rate and airspeed, maintaining position through geometry rather than visual reference. Flak bursts filled the turning radius. German gunners fired continuous patterns, anticipating where bombers would be 5 seconds ahead. Lieutenant James Hopper, flying tail-end position, watched flak burst exactly where his aircraft would have been if he'd turned conventionally. But Lewis's geometry had him turning at a different radius. The shell burst 200 feet ahead, showering his aircraft with minor shrapnel but causing no critical damage. At 14:39, a B-17 in the 3rd Squadron took a direct hit, not through the steel net geometry, just statistically inevitable. Shrapnel penetrated the cockpit and killed the co-pilot, Lieutenant Donald Shaw. The pilot, Lieutenant Henry Palmer, severely wounded in the shoulder. He checked his instruments, altitude dropping to 23,000 feet, airspeed decreasing to 154 miles per hour. Palmer couldn't maintain assigned parameters. The geometry required him to drop out of formation, but he radioed his element leader. I'm staying close, maintaining heading and approximate position even if altitude is compromised. He stayed in the general vicinity of the formation, protected by its geometric presence even though he couldn't hold exact position. In conventional formations, damaged aircraft falling out of position became isolated targets. German fighters would attack stragglers. But the steel net's vertical depth, formation stacked through 1,000 feet of altitude, meant Palmer's lower altitude still kept him within the protective envelope. At 1443, the formation completed the rally turn and steadied on egress heading. The flak continued for another 3 minutes as they flew over Rouland's defensive perimeter. Then, at 1446, they cleared the flak box. The explosion stopped. The sky went quiet except for engine noise. 47 bombers had entered Rouland's flak defenses. 47 were still flying. Every aircraft had damage. Shrapnel holes in wings, fuselages, control surfaces. 2 aircraft had engine fires extinguished. 1 had collapsed landing gear. 3 had wounded crew members, but they were flying. All 47. In the steel net geometry, heading west toward England. The formation crossed the German border at 1530. At 1545, they crossed the Dutch coast outbound. German fighters didn't intercept. P-51 escorts had swept the area before the bombers arrived. At 1640, the first B-17s appeared over Kimbolton airfield. Lewis stood in the control tower watching them return. He'd been listening to radio reports throughout the mission. He knew they'd completed the bombing run. He knew they'd taken flak damage, but he didn't know how many would return. The first bomber broke through then the second. Then the third and fourth. They kept coming. By 1715, all 47 had landed. 3 made emergency landings at alternate fields due to damage, but all 47 landed successfully. The group operations officer compiled the damage report. 1,847 shrapnel holes across 47 aircraft, 3 engines destroyed, 11 crew members wounded, 1 killed, but the aircraft loss rate, 0%. Previous missions to Rouland had lost between 8 and 14 aircraft per group. Expected losses for a 4-7 aircraft mission to that target, 9 to 11 bombers. Lewis's steel net formation had lost 0. The mission was successful, but proving it mathematically was harder than flying it. General Curtis LeMay arrived at Kimbolton on September 13th to review the results personally. LeMay, who'd called Lewis's system a waste of resources, now stood in front of reconnaissance photographs showing Rochlin's synthetic oil plant with 68% of production capacity destroyed. Accurate bombing from a dispersed formation. Something he'd said was impossible. LeMay interviewed 6 pilots personally. He asked each the same question: could you maintain defensive fire discipline in that formation? All 6 answered yes. The wider spacing actually improved gunnery. Less turbulence from adjacent aircraft, clearer fields of fire, better visual tracking of approaching fighters. Then LeMay asked the critical question: would you fly this formation into Germany again? All 6 answered immediately, yes. LeMay spent 2 hours reviewing Lewis's mathematics, formation cards, geometric calculations, spacing tolerances, fuel consumption data, bombing accuracy statistics. At 1600 hours on September 13th, LeMay issued Operational Directive 44217. All 8th Air Force heavy bombardment groups would transition to geometric dispersion formation protocols within 14 days. The steel net would become standard doctrine. But implementing the system across the entire 8th Air Force, 40 bombardment groups, over 2,000 heavy bombers, required training that Lewis hadn't fully developed yet. He'd proven the concept with one highly motivated group flying one mission. Scaling it to the entire force meant creating training protocols, standardized formation cards for different group sizes, and instrument flying procedures that could be taught to pilots with varying skill levels. Lewis worked 72 hours straight designing the training curriculum. The system needed a formal name. Someone in the operations section started calling it Formation Lewis in mission reports. The crews still called it the steel net. Official documentation listed it as Geometric Dispersion Protocol, but gradually, Formation Lewis became the accepted term. The first mass implementation came on September 28, 1944. Target: Magdeburg. 12 bombardment groups, 634 B-17s and B-24s, all flying variants of Lewis's geometry. That mission encountered the heaviest flak concentrations recorded in 8th Air Force history. German commanders knew the Americans were trying something different and concentrated every available gun on the approach routes. The 8th lost 14 bombers. Statistically, they should have lost 67. On October 7th, another mass mission to Merseburg, the target that had killed 38 bombers on a single raid in August. This time, 11 bombers lost from a force of 572. The mathematics proved out across thousands of aircraft and dozens of missions. Loss rates to flak dropped from an average of 6.8% per mission to 2.1%. That difference represented thousands of aircrew lives. By November 1944, Formation Lewis was standard doctrine throughout the 8th Air Force. Some groups modified the geometry slightly for their specific aircraft and tactics, but the fundamental principle, mathematical positioning instead of visual formation, became foundational. The Germans adapted. They increased flak density, fired faster barrages, adjusted timing. But the geometry worked because it was based on physics, not psychology. Wider spacing meant fewer aircraft damaged per shell burst. That equation didn't change regardless of German tactics. Lewis was promoted to full colonel in December 1944 and reassigned to Air Force headquarters in Washington to develop formation doctrine for the planned invasion of Japan. His system would be adapted for B-29 Superfortress operations over Tokyo. He never flew a combat mission. He spent the war flying a desk, manipulating numbers, fighting battles with mathematics instead of machine guns. The war ended before his B-29 formation protocols were fully implemented. By the end of the European air campaign in May 1945, Formation Lewis had been flown on 847 combat missions involving 34,628 bomber sorties. Statistical analysis by Air Force Operations Research calculated that the formation geometry prevented the loss of approximately 380 heavy bombers that would have been destroyed using conventional formation doctrine. At 10 crew members per bomber, that meant 3,800 aircrew who survived because Malcolm Lewis understood trigonometry better than he understood flying. The formal commendations arrived slowly. Lewis received the Legion of Merit in January 1945 for exceptionally meritorious conduct in the performance of outstanding services in the development of advanced formation tactics resulting in significantly reduced combat losses. The citation didn't mention him by name in popular press. No magazine articles, no newsreel coverage. The combat crews knew. Bomber pilots in England talked about flying Lewis geometry, the way infantry talked about fire and maneuver. The system saved their lives on missions where previous doctrine would have killed them. But outside the bomber groups, his name remained unknown. The official Air Force history of the strategic bombing campaign, published in 1947, devoted 2 paragraphs to formation innovation. Lewis wasn't mentioned. He separated from active duty in September 1945 with the rank of colonel. He returned to Massillon, Ohio, and resumed work at his father's engineering firm. Nobody in Massillon knew what he'd done during the war. When people asked, he said he'd worked at Air Force headquarters doing operations analysis. That was technically accurate. It didn't convey that he'd invented a system that saved thousands of lives. Malcolm Lewis lived in Massillon for the rest of his life. He married in 1947 a woman named Catherine who'd worked at Wright Field during the war. They had 2 daughters. He coached Little League baseball. He served on the City Planning Commission. He attended First Presbyterian Church on Sundays. The engineering firm struggled in the late 1940s. As post-war construction declined, Lewis worked increasingly long hours trying to keep the business viable. In 1952, they closed the firm. Lewis took a job as a civil engineer with the Ohio Department of Highways, designing bridge approaches and intersection geometry. He rarely mentioned the war. His daughters knew he'd served, but he never discussed specifics. When asked, he'd say he'd worked in operations planning, nothing exciting. One daughter, interviewed years later, said she didn't learn about Formation Lewis until after his death. He stayed connected with a few men from the 384th Bombardment Group. Christmas cards, occasional letters. In 1953, a group of former pilots organized a reunion in Dayton. The reunion photograph shows him standing in the back row, not in uniform, looking uncomfortable. Most of the men in the photo were pilots wearing their leather jackets and aviator sunglasses. Lewis wore a gray suit. At the reunion banquet, one of the pilots stood up and proposed a toast to Colonel Lewis, who saved more of us than any fighter pilot. The room applauded. Lewis gave a brief nod and sat back down. He didn't give a speech. In 1954, the Air Force published a comprehensive study of tactical innovations in World War II. Formation Lewis received 4 pages of technical analysis. The report was classified and circulated only to senior staff officers and tactical training schools. Lewis developed heart problems in 1956. He took early retirement from the Highway Department. His health declined through 1957. On November 8, 1957, Malcolm Clarence Lewis died of a heart attack at his home in Massillon. He was 47 years old. The obituary in the Massillon Evening Independent listed him as a civil engineer and World War II veteran. No mention of his innovation, no mention of the lives he'd saved. He was buried at Massillon Cemetery. The headstone read, Malcolm C. Lewis, Colonel, U.S. Army Air Forces, 1910-1957. His personal papers, including his original calculations for the steel net formation and copies of mission reports, were donated to the Air Force Historical Research Agency in 1959 by his widow. The papers were catalogued and filed. Researchers occasionally referenced them when studying bombing campaign tactics, but Lewis's name remained obscure outside specialist circles. For 30 years, Formation Lewis was taught at Air Force tactical training schools as geometric dispersion protocol, a standard formation technique with no specific attribution to its inventor. Student pilots learned the geometry. They didn't learn that a man who barely qualified for combat flight status had invented it by analyzing mathematics in a Quonset hut in England. The system saved thousands of lives. The man who invented it died pumping gas money from a civil service pension in a small Ohio town, forgotten by everyone except a few bomber pilots who sent Christmas cards. Formation Lewis influenced air combat doctrine for decades after World War II. The fundamental principle that mathematical positioning could provide better protection than visual tight formation became foundational in strategic bomber tactics during the Cold War. B-52 formations over the Soviet Union would have used geometric dispersion protocols derived directly from Lewis's World War II geometry. The system also influenced formation flying in non-combat contexts. Modern airshow demonstration teams use dispersed formations based on similar geometric principles. Commercial aviation adopted elements of Lewis's instrument-based positioning for flights in poor visibility. But the story of Malcolm Lewis himself disappeared into archival obscurity. Post-war military histories focused on commanders, pilots, and ground combat innovations. Tactical innovations developed by staff officers rarely received attention. The heroes were men who flew and fought, not men who calculated and analyzed. Lewis's name resurfaced briefly in 1988 when aviation historian Dr. Stephen Ambrose interviewed several 8th Air Force veterans for a book project. Multiple pilots independently mentioned Formation Lewis as one of the most important tactical innovations of the air campaign. Ambrose researched the name, found Lewis's archived papers, and included a short section about him in his book The Wild Blue. That book brought limited recognition. The Air Force Historical Foundation published a retrospective article about Lewis in 1991. A few aviation magazines ran features. In 2003, the Air Force named a conference room at the Air Warfare Center after him, but public recognition remained minimal. There are no memorials to Malcolm Lewis, no statues, no museums exhibits, no documentary films. A man who mathematically saved thousands of lives is remembered primarily in technical manuals and obscure historical journals. The formation he invented outlived his recognition by generations. That's the paradox of technical innovation in warfare. The tools become standard, the inventors are forgotten. Pilots today fly instrument approaches using principles Lewis helped pioneer. They don't know his name. 47 B-17 Flying Fortresses entered the most lethal flak corridor in the European theater on September 11, 1944. 47 came home. The Army had called Malcolm Lewis's steel net the dumbest waste of money in aviation history. Every aeronautical expert said the geometry was impossible. Every experienced combat pilot said tight formations were the only survival. They were wrong. The mathematics proved them wrong. The mission results proved them wrong. The 3,800 aircrew who survived flak that should have killed them were living proof. And the man who saved them died unknown, pumping gas in Ohio, buried under a headstone that didn't mention his achievement. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Every like helps rescue another forgotten story from silence. These men, the ones who flew and the ones who planned, deserve better than obscurity. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about soldiers and engineers who proved themselves with skill and intellect. Real people. Real innovation. Real heroism that came from mathematical precision, not just physical courage. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, Germany, Japan, Poland, France? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Tell us if you knew about Formation Lewis before this video. Tell us if this changed how you think about military innovation. Just let us know you're here, and if you know any veterans, any engineers, any historians who should hear this story, share this video with them. Send them the link. Post it to your social media. Help us spread the story of Malcolm Lewis. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Colonel Malcolm Lewis and the 3,800 aircrew who flew his geometry home don't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, the ones who flew the bombers, the ones who designed the formations, the ones who did the impossible mathematics while everyone else said it couldn't be done, and you're helping make that happen. We'll see you in the next story.